What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka New York Prepper, and I wanted to do a very important video in the Prepping 101 series, and it's about the Golden Horde, or the mass exodus of people from heavily populated urban areas in the country after an SHTF situation or a major disaster. So if you've never heard the term the Golden Horde, basically it's just kind of a term that was, kind of coined by James Rawls. He's a survivalist and an author of survivalist books, and he's a former Army intelligence officer, and he coined the term the Golden Horde to describe, a mass exodus of people from densely populated areas within the United States after an SHTF situation. Um, so what you're looking at here is a map from the 2010 census showing the population density in the United States. And although it's obscured on this map, you have a color coding that shows the amount of people per square mile, and you can see the darker color shades of red show the most densest population of people in the country. And just looking at the map from a high level perspective, you can see pretty much the densest population of people is in the Northeast, along the I-95 corridor from Washington, D.C., through Philadelphia, New York City, and then up to Boston. And this area basically comprises of a giant urban area. There's suburban areas mixed in, and even some rural areas mixed in as well. But, pretty much New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Maryland, southeastern Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and eastern Massachusetts. It's a giant urban area, and this area has a lot of people in it. And just using this area as an example, if you add up the population of all these people in that area, you're probably looking at 40 to 50 million people easily just in that one small area. And you have to understand, when people live in cities, they're 100% reliant on the infrastructure, that city provides for them, whether it's municipal water supply, sewage systems, and power supply. Those three things are critical in order for a major metropolitan area to function. If the city can't pump water into the faucets of people's houses, they're not going to have water for drinking or cooking or bathing. In a lot of these urban areas, there's not a lot of fresh water sources, like lakes and streams that are clean enough to actually gather water and drink from. And also in these cities, there's not a lot of places to gather food naturally, to hunt, to fish, to grow. Most people in urban areas, they don't have yards where they can grow vegetables or have chickens. So that's why a lot of people in the cities are going to flee, and that's what they're going to create, what's called the Golden Horde. Um, and what that is basically just a mass exodus of people from these cities. And like, if we look at the Northeast, you have all these people in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York City, Boston, Connecticut. That whole area is very heavily populated, and you have 40 or 50 million people or more that are 100% reliant on the power grid, on municipal water, municipal sewage, and grocery stores to get their food, their water, their shelter, their power, their heating. Everything is controlled by the cities. Even the heating, and if you live in a city, your heat is controlled by the city. You can't have your own oil tank or a wood stove, because you live in an apartment or a brownstone or something like that. You're 100% reliant on the city to provide heat for you. And you're 100% reliant on the city to provide power and sewage and trash removal and water. Everything is controlled by the city. So when those critical infrastructures collapse, after an SHTF situation, people are going to start to panic because they're going to realize that they don't have the resources they need to live. They don't have clean water. They don't have a place to eliminate sewage. They don't have a place to get food. It's dangerous. After an SHTF situation, urban areas are going to be extremely dangerous because you're going to have a lot of people that are going to be, tempted by, human nature to commit crimes because there's going to be a lack of police presence, and it's going to cause a lot of people in those cities to flee, and they're going to go outwards from the cities to the nearby suburbs and nearby rural areas that are within at half a tank to one tank of gas away from their city that they live in. And as an example, if we look at New York City, Boston, or this northeastern metro area, you can see that you have about 40 to 50 million people in all those cities. And once they find out that the power's not coming back on, and that the water is not clean anymore, that they're not getting heat pumped into their building, they're going to look for a way to escape, and they're going to have to go somewhere. They're going to take their families and they're going to evacuate. And the areas that they evacuate to are typically going to be within half a tank to one gas tank of one gas tank away from where they live. They're not going to go extremely far because that's just human nature. So you're looking at maybe 2 to 3 hours car drive away from where they live, and they're going to look for resources. Depending on the nature of the SHTF situation, they may even have to plunder and pillage in order to feed their families. And this is an important concept as a prepper to understand, and to make sure that when you're planning your bug out location or your primary residence, that you avoid locating yourself too close to these major metro areas like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. Those areas are pretty much death traps after an SHTF situation. And we've even seen in the past what happens, like Hurricane Sandy hit the New York City area, and it was total chaos, and a lot of people that live in urban areas don't have a preparedness mindset, and they're disconnected from living off of the land because, these are people that are 100% reliant on their 9 to 5 jobs in order to pay their bills. And a lot of them, because they live in a city, they lost a lot of the skills that are needed in order to survive outside of a city, in a country environment. So they have limited skills, and when the power goes out and they're so used to having their grocery store and having their power, once that's all taken away, people are going to panic, and they're going to try to go outwards from the city to search for resources, to search for water and food and shelter. And if you live on the outskirts of a major city, or if you have bug out property, or a bug out retreat close to a major city, then you better be prepared to deal with a mass exodus of people from the cities. And it's also possible too that a lot of people, when they're panicked, when people get hungry and thirsty and they're driven to extremes, they will do extreme things to survive. And if you have, let's say New York City, for me, that's the closest example, because New York City's, within a half a tank of gas away from me, by car. And, you have 9 million people just in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Once the power goes out over there and people realize that the power's never coming back, they're not going to stay there. They're going to look to go outwards away from the city and find a better place for them and their family. And if they don't have food, if they don't have water, and they don't have a vehicle, you better believe that they're going to do whatever it takes for them to survive. And if that means stealing your vehicle, if that means forcibly taking food from you, or, breaking into your home and stealing your supplies, or stealing your, food, stealing your water, whatever, you better believe that there's a high probability that a lot of people will do that, especially because like I said, urban people don't have survival skills. They don't have a preparedness mindset. They don't believe in prepping. They don't believe in survival skills. So they're not going to be able to gather their own food. They're not going to be able to gather their own water and make it out there on their own. They're going to look for somebody to take care of them, or they're going to try to, let's say, barter with you, or they may just try to take your stuff, because they're not self-sufficient enough in the countryside. They've built up great skills in the urban area and mastering life in the urban area, but they have zero skills outside of urban areas, except for occasional camping trips, maybe. So a lot of those people, you can't underestimate them, because when they're hungry, they're going to look for food. If they have children to feed, you better believe that they're going to feed their children. And if it means stealing your food, they're going to do it. So don't just think that only, criminals and bad people are going to be a threat to you after SHTF. The common citizen is going to be a threat, especially urban dwellers. A lot of urban dwellers, as I mentioned, they don't have survival skills. A lot of them don't believe in prepping because their philosophies on life, their perspectives and their points of view are skewed because they lived in a city so long, and they feel like, oh, we never had any problems in the past, so why should I have to prep, and that's how, if you go into major cities, you'll see a lot of the people that live in cities, they have that mindset where, they feel that nothing bad can ever happen, that, because in the past, there may have been one hurricane 20 years ago, and they feel that there'll never be a hurricane again. And it's been proven that, Mother Nature or God, doesn't act the way that we want him to. He acts according to the way he wants to. And an example was Hurricane Sandy in 2012. The New York City area was decimated by, this freak hurricane that nobody ever expected. New York City was not prepared for it. People were not prepared for it. There was people fighting for gas. People didn't have power for weeks. Most people didn't even have basic preps. They didn't have flashlights, generators, basic supplies they didn't have because they're so used to, the grid and being reliant on, the comfort and convenience of modern lifestyle, and the urban lifestyle of having everything at your fingertips, and, being able to go to the grocery store all the time, and just getting used to that lifestyle. It breeds people who are not uh, aware of their surroundings and aware of the potential hazards. So the Golden Horde is an important concept, and if you live, within 60 miles or 100 miles of a major metropolitan area, like DC, Philly, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Detroit, Miami, Atlanta, Boston, New York City, all the biggest cities in the country. If you live within half a tank of gas away from these cities, or you have, you're considering getting a bug out property in those cities, you better, you know, be prepared to deal with, hungry people that are going to be fleeing the cities after SHTF happens, and they're going to ransack your house potentially. And they, if you have bug out property, they may ransack that as well. Um, so ideally the best situation is to have bug out property that's over a tank of gas away from any major US city, because most urban dwellers, they're not going to go tremendously far, especially if there's bad terrain, or they have limited supplies. They're not going to stretch their car all the way out till they have no gas, so they're going to go maybe 200 miles, 300 miles max. That's just human nature. Most people are not going to drive across the country after an SHTF. They're going to go relatively close, and they're going to look for resources relatively close. They're going to look for houses that they can ransack, or, they're going to ask people to live with them, or, barter or whatever. So ideally, you should have a bug out location that's beyond that range of the Golden Horde and the mass exodus of unprepared people that are going to be fleeing the city. And if you could have a primary residence away from that area, that would be even better. If you reside in a smaller town or smaller city that's further away from a metro area, like, a good example would be like, Spokane, Washington, or, smaller cities, Albany, New York, things like that, cities that are less than 250,000 people or even less than 100,000 people, cities like that where you can actually, have a decent paying job in your field, but you're not going to have to work in a major metropolitan area and have to deal with these unprepared people that are going to be, fleeing out to the suburbs and surrounding rural areas looking for resources. Um, so that's pretty much it. I just wanted to do this video on the Golden Horde and the mass exodus of unprepared people from major U.S. cities. If you live or commute to a major city, you should definitely be prepared and be ready to deal with unprepared people that are going to be fleeing the city after an SHTF situation, especially if you live in one of the northeastern cities like DC, Philly, New Jersey, New York City, Connecticut, Boston. That area is basically one giant city. Along I-95, if you drive from Washington D.C. up to Boston, it's one giant city along the I-95 highway. Um, and if you live in that area or nearby, you should be ready to deal with the mass exodus of people from those areas, because they're going to be going outward to look for resources. So I just wanted to bring up this important concept and mention it to you guys. And I'll catch you guys later. Remember the 3 P's: prepare, practice, and persevere. You prepare by storing essential gear and supplies. You practice with your gear and supplies. You practice using them to build your skills and confidence with your preps. And then you persevere, because after preparing and practicing, you are in a better position to persevere through an SHTF situation. And remember, too, that SHTF is a mental game. It's not just about your preparations and how much you've practiced with them, but it's also mental toughness and mental discipline that's going to get you through the SHTF situation. And you need to have some mental toughness and motivation to persevere. So remember the 3 P's: prepare, practice, and persevere. All right, guys, take care and God bless.